Take it away, Brian.
Are we live?
We are live.
All right. Welcome, guys, to an inaugural tournament for an inaugural format. I'm here with Anders, also known as Gandalf the Dark. I'm also here with Chad Lawler. And we're going to be taking you through the first of what is hopefully many matches to showcase a brand new format that was pioneered quite recently, actually. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, probably within the last month or so. And it is known as the Four Horsemen of old school Magic. Many of you out there who have probably played various formats, I think there are probably there are 3 or 4 formats that are played around the world. And despite the fact that they're all subtly different, they all involve generally a card pool that spans from the Alpha set all the way to at least the Dark, and some of them include actually the Fallen Empire set. And we've gone in a different direction here. It seems a little bit crazy when you first think about it, but the focus of this format is something that has been labeled as the Four Horsemen. And the Four Horsemen are, as you see in front of you, the first 4 Magic expansions. That's right, there's no Alpha at all, which is a huge departure from what people normally associate with the old school format, where it contains the famous mock set, the blue power cards, everything else. This is pardon the jets flying overhead. This is a format that does not include any of those cards. It is uncharted ground. We've been referring to it as the Wild West of Magic. And quite curious to know from Anders, when you first heard about the format, what did you think of it?
I thought it was really interesting. I mean, and also potentially a bit problematic, perhaps, because we discussed this briefly before, but there's a lot of cards that are lacking in this format, right? But on the other hand, we have like a concentration of a lot of the cards that we really love in the old school, that we have a lot of romantic feelings towards in the old school scene. So I was really digging it.
Yeah, I think that for me, that was one of the most appealing things about it, actually, because if you think about what does Alpha offer to the old school format, and primarily what Alpha offers is degeneracy and speed and removal. Yeah. Alpha is not known for creatures. In fact, if you look at the best creatures that have been come along in old school format, there aren't really too many of them that come from Alpha. There's some iconic things, Sarah Angel, there's obviously Hypnotic Spectre, a few other things, but most
Savannah Alliance.
Savannah Alliance, and I probably will think of a few others, but most of the best creatures that actually exist in old school format come from later sets. And so you have these great creatures that are counteracted by extremely powerful removal, card drawing, and acceleration, which is really what's endemic to Alpha. So what happens in a format where you take all of that crazy speed and all the removal away, and you just have the really powerful permanents that have come in those later sets? And that's sort of what this experiment is all about. Chad Lawler, the founder of the format, or one of the co-founders of the format, has referred to it as the Wild West of Magic. And along those lines, we should probably cover the restricted list, because that's obviously a very, very defining part. I think that's our next slide here. So there's a little Wild West slide, and it's funny actually, because I referred to original Magic. I started playing the game back in January of 1994, and it was pretty much the Wild West. Not just because the internet was in its infancy. It did exist in the form of something called the Usenet, which was these sort of bizarre, archaic news groups that you had to log in on a cable modem, or not a cable modem, actually, a dial-up modem. And if you knew exactly what URL to enter, you could navigate your way to whatever the official rules were at the time. And you had to know the entire string. It was something like rec.games.deckmaster.tradingcards.rules. That took you to the rules. And when I was playing in those very, very early years, or early months, I should say, nobody knew what the rules actually were. There was all these mysteries about edicts from on high from Wizards of the Coast, but nobody really knew exactly what the rule set was. And so, and on top of that, as you traveled around and you played in different communities, because I traveled around a lot to compete, mainly because there were tournaments here and there and they offered prizes. So it was kind of a way to subsidize the hobby. And you'd show up and they'd have house rules, specific house rules about cards that you were not allowed to play, cards that you're only allowed to play with one of, cards that you are, and even things like, I went to this one shop and they had a house rule about not being allowed to channel Fireball anyone before turn 3. They just weren't allowed to do it. And I was wondering, what the hell? Like what's going on?
I can actually one up you there. I went through one where you can't do direct damage with spells. You can only do
Exactly.
creatures.
I mean, that's the Wild West of Magic, right? And everybody had their own idea about what the game was about. There was wide disagreement about the rules because there wasn't a centralized rules arbiter that you could go to. There wasn't a resource. And gradually by about 95, 96, when the Magic Dojo came along and there started to be some standardization and Wizards of the Coast was good and transparent about communicating to the public what you could and couldn't play with, then it started to become a little bit less like the Wild West. It was kind of just like, a dusty one-horse town, but you weren't allowed to just shoot people on the street. There was like a sheriff and stuff, and it really changed how everybody felt about the format. But one of the, I think, original intentions, and you'll see when we move to the restricted list here and the banned list, it is super lean, mainly because it's a brand new format. It's nascent. We don't really know. You don't really know, other than your just basic instincts about the format, you don't really know what is going to be overpowered. And sometimes it's surprising with formats like this that your original conceptions about what's going to be dominant don't necessarily align with what rises to the top, not only because of how players approach the format and they metagame, but also because without the alpha cards, which sort of informs our understanding of old school, things may not be as powerful as you think that they are. And cards that are hyper impactful in old school aren't necessarily good in this format. And so you can see right in front of us, there's only 4 cards that are restricted, and really only one of them has warranted restriction outside in major formats. You see Library of Alexandria, of course, an obvious choice for restriction. I think that everybody can universally agree that this card is incredibly problematic in every old school format that exists. And even when there's a singleton of it, you can imagine what having 4 of them in the format would be like. Every deck would basically be Library of Alexandria .deck, and I think that would be unavoidable. Although, incidentally, when I first started competing and playing Magic in tournaments, that card was unrestricted up until I would say June or July of 1994. So you could actually build decks with 4 Libraries of Alexandria, which is pretty fun. What do you think about the rest of the restricted list?
Well, I like this approach, we talked about this briefly before we met, but I think that the idea of keeping it really lean and then play testing a lot, because as you said, we have all these armchair theories, but we need to put it out there and we need to see what's broken and what's not broken. But I also like that, as you mentioned, that we are keeping Library of Alexandria restricted, but also we have all the cards that are like hosting an entire edition. And that's pretty important when you only have 4 editions, right? If you like have 4 cities in a bottle, it'll wreck so many decks. The one thing here is like the Arena of the Ancients. That's
it's like a hoser that's not a hoser.
Yeah.
And maybe that's for the best anyway, right? I mean, I think that most people, I've actually talked with Richard about this personally, about City in a Bottle and why the card was made. I said, why on earth did you put a card in a set that kills everything from the set? He said, well, we weren't really sure about the balance of Arabian Nights. We were very concerned that there was stuff in there that was just too good.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah, it's a good expansion.
We wanted City in a Bottle. It's a very, very good expansion. And we wanted City in a Bottle as a stopgap against that. It sort of does the testing for us. And if players determine that Arabian Nights is too good, they have access to this card to sort of tamp it down a little bit so that it doesn't just overshadow everything that's available in Magic. So
it was like an emergency break, something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Although incidentally, the original design aesthetic and intention of Arabian Nights was that it was its own standalone game. That's why it was actually supposed to be Magic the Gathering Arabian Nights versus Magic the Gathering, the original set, right? With different card back colors and stuff. And so there was a lot of last minute changes. And I think City in the Bottle probably just slipped its way through. I'm sure in retrospect that you notice not only in terms of cost, but power level. If we go on the progression of City in a Bottle to Arena to Golgotha and Silex, you go 2, 3, 4, and their impact on the game. I guess arguably a Golgotha and Silex is more powerful than Arena because it actually affects more legends.
Affects, and usable cards.
And actual usable cards. Although, of course, if you go back to the design aesthetic of 1994, I'm sure that people, for the most part, I mean, Elder Dragons were one of the chase rares and legends.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Which meant that giant, they're 8 mana, right? They're like 2 of 3 different colors and 2.
Yeah, and 2 colors.
That 8 mana flyers, 7/7 flyers with upkeep were considered, top tier competitive things, and therefore you needed Arena of the Ancients.
I played with Nicol Bolas in my first deck. I loved him.
Yes, I mean, if the game goes a long time, right? He's
Yeah.
he's very, very powerful.
Discard your entire hand.
Yep. So we've got a ban list, of course, also, and it contains 4 cards that show up on pretty much every ban list that isn't involved in Ante. We've got from left to right, Jeweled Bird, Tempest of Freet, Bronze Tablet, and Rebirth. And those, of course, are just banned by default. They don't really add anything to the format anyway, and are, of course, inappropriate because there's no Ante. And then there's this one outlier with Shahrazad, which I was kind of curious to see, actually. What do you think about Shahrazad on the ban list and why it's there?
I think it's mostly for practical reasons, right? Just to avoid games going into the 3 hours.
Which is already a problem.
Yeah.
With online
Probably,
play.
I think so.
Yeah, it seems like the card has remained on the ban list, surprisingly unbanned and unrestricted in numerous old school formats, and people have actually gone and tried to make it work. And I know that some decks have actually been successful running Shahrazad.
Yeah, Quick White used it back in the day, I remember.
Yeah, I mean, the card is, I'm not bullish on it at all. I think fundamentally the card just doesn't work because the problem with it is that you can't do anything to guarantee that you have any advantage in the subgame, and you actually have a disadvantage in the subgame, and you still have more Shahrazads in your deck, which don't do anything.
Yeah,
and that just makes you intrinsically weaker in the subgame. There's no way that you can actually leverage the subgame somehow to be stronger without getting lucky. I mean, obviously that's just variance. Yeah. But over many, many games, Shahrazad confers no intrinsic advantage by being in your deck. It only carries disadvantage because it's a dead card. So it seems to me that over the long run, you're actually at a disadvantage in the subgame versus an advantage on average.
Oh yeah, I totally agree. I think the idea in Quick White is that you want to have an early game as much as possible because you dominate that and you might make a quick kill. So you like rolling the dice several times because you like restarting the game over and over.
Yeah, but then you might just wind up dealing 10 damage to yourself also for no reason.
Exactly, yeah.
Because it turns out that the subsection of your deck that you drew doesn't have any of your vices because they were in the first, you know what I mean? Like it's just, obviously there are many, many games where the card seems insane because you sub-game, win quickly and deal 10 or 8 or something, and you go, man, this card's amazing. But there's so many other games that is not the case at all. And there's some games you literally can't even cast it because you've drawn all your restricted list early, and now you're going to go to a sub game where the other guy has a restricted list and you don't. But anyway, I think with that said, oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, let's jump over to, we're just going to review what's going on here. So this was an event that ran from looks like the 25th of June to the 30th of July. So roughly a month-long span, which seems about right for webcam-based online events. Hard to really get the games in faster than that, given people's disparate schedules and the timing and stuff. And by a month, most of the matches have run its course. We're actually going to be covering games today that are from the semifinals, as all the Swiss rounds finished, and I believe it was run as a Swiss tournament. Correct me if I'm wrong.
I think you're right. I think the next one is like he called it geopooling or something like that, but this one was Swiss.
Yeah. So, and I think that for the second tournament going forward, I don't want to dwell on that too much, but considering this is the inaugural tournament, we're focusing on it. But it is definitely, for people out there that are running online events, it's much, much easier to use asynchronous pod play, where you basically play a round robin against a pod, and then the winners of those pods progress to the finals, where it's the quarterfinals, where it's much easier to organize the players. And given the fact that people enjoy these formats from all over the world, it's really, really hard to align people in a way that works with Swiss. It's very hard to track down the next player who has a similar record, and just tracking the records in general is a nightmare. So the next format, the next tournament for this format will be that. So we're going to look at the decks real quick. Our first match is actually going to focus on the players on the left side of this, the semifinal deck list here. And if we could bring the first one up, that'll be Steven, Goblin King, Rook Egg, Tower Tax Edge. This is straight red-white, actually. We're going to have quite a bit of things to say. I'm sure you've got some thoughts about it as well. And I think that when most people looked at the card pool for this format, and specifically the restricted list, I think this is one of the decks that immediately comes to mind. This is a really interesting build of it, but I think it contains quite a few of the key pieces that you'd expect with from a regular old school version, with some obvious substitutions given the constraints of the format. Starting in the upper left-hand corner, though, there's actually something I would not have thought to use, actually, and I'd be quite curious to know from the original designer why he opted to use these. But there are 4 copies of Rook Egg, which are the only creatures in the deck outside of Mishra's Factories. Rook Eggs are a little expensive, 4 mana, but at the same time, they're kind of hard to get around. They block a lot of early creatures, and they synergize well with Moat. They're almost like Moats 4, 5, and 6. I think he's got 3 Moats there. Yeah, I think that.
Looks like it.
It certainly looks like that. But they're definitely. There's a lot of decks. There isn't a lot of removal, and the best removal, certainly the most efficient removal, is Chain Lightning, followed probably by Spirit Link. And Rook Egg is pretty good against both of those because the rook that you get out of it is a 4/4, so it evades the Chain Lightning. Below that, he has what I would consider probably one of the top tier candidates for future restriction in the format. This is a card that I remember doing commentary for X-Point old school a couple of months back, and it was really just land tax format. The card was clearly just dominating. Nearly all the decks in the top 8 were land tax decks. And it is super powerful, particularly in a format where there really isn't a lot of card draw. And the fact that you can play land tax and the format's slower, people can't navigate their way around land tax with Moxes and Soul Ring and Black Lotus and stuff. Fellwar Stone's really your only source of fast mana that's reasonable. That makes land tax way, way, way more insane and powerful. And consequently, he's got 3 copies of Land's Edge. And interestingly enough, you can't tell from the top copy of it right there, but Land's Edge is actually an enchant world as well, and has interaction with all the other enchant worlds in the game, in the format. This deck, I think, is less vulnerable to enchant worlds by nature of the fact that it's almost creatureless. So you don't have to worry about Abyss as much. But there are other enchant worlds, and being able to destroy those enchant worlds with land tax or with Land's Edge is pretty handy. What do you think about the decision to use 3 Land's Edge versus 4? Would you have run 3, 4, 2? What do you think is the right number?
I think 3 is about right. I mean, you need a lot of moving parts until you can use it, and usually you would only play it when you can go for the killing move, right? So I think 3 is about right in this. I mean, the early game will be about surviving, right, and just holding the other guy back until you can get your combination going. And the key point here will be the land tax, and maybe in conjunction with those Winds of Change. I really like that with land tax.
Yeah, for sure. One interesting thing is that the inclusion of only 3 copies of Land's Edge, and I've seen lists with anywhere from 1 to 4 copies of the card, right? It sort of depends on what kind of a version you're playing of this deck. But I think you're right. I think that 3, maybe even 2, is probably the right number, given the fact that outside of counter magic, there's no real way to interact with that card. I mean, obviously somebody could play their own enchant world, but there aren't really too many of them being played. But
there's a twister in round 6.
Yeah, in round 6. Yeah, I mean, give me a break, right? And a lot of time you're just playing Land's Edge and you're just dealing 12 with it right away anyway, or even 14, possibly even 7 or 18.
It's a finisher, right?
Right, as a finisher, exactly. But they're probably not going to disenchant it because disenchant's not in the format. And that's actually something that you'll see as we go through the deck list. A number of these decks are taking advantage of the fact that there is, by nature of the fact that we're playing the Four Horsemen format, there just aren't that many ways to interact with enchantments outside of countering them. Along those lines, there's 3 copies of Moat in the deck. And when I was looking at kind of holes to exploit in the format when I was first introduced to it, it did seem like Moat was a real outlier in power level. And I was definitely drawn to the card in terms of, like, obviously you're going to play Moat in every deck, right? It's so good. It's not even an enchant world, so there's basically no way to kill it. But the thing is that players have predicted this, and most of the decks that are effective in the format don't care about Moat at all. And so it's interesting that even though Moat is so powerful, everybody understands this intrinsically. It's not like it's a big surprise. And therefore, one of the first questions you ask yourself when you're building a Four Horsemen deck is, how does my deck deal with Moat? Can I deal with it? And if you can't deal with Moat, you probably shouldn't even come to the party. And recognizing that almost all of these decks are pretty inoculated against the card. I mean, they're vulnerable against it to a certain degree, but they all have ways of circumventing the card without having to directly deal with it. You'll see he's got 4 copies of Divine Offering. It's just the automatic substitution for disenchant. And in this format, honestly, I mean, we mentioned how you can't interact with enchantments, but Divine Offering is probably, in many cases, it's better, right? We've seen so many decks that are running a huge critical mass of artifacts, and very expensive artifacts too, by nature of the fact that if you harken back to the restricted list, Mishra's Workshop is legal as a 4 of in the format. And whenever that's going to happen, people are going to feel really a lot of pressure to play big artifacts.
And 4 mana drains.
And 4 mana drains too, right? To ramp out those huge artifacts.
Yeah.
in terms of like what you're able to do in this format, given the fact that the big X spells from Alpha don't exist, no Fireball, no Disintegrate, no Brain Geyser, no Mind Twist, there's Recall, there's no Earthquake. There's very, very few things to do with a lot of mana. And so people are naturally going to be pushing the direction of big colorless artifacts, and that makes Divine Offering just totally insane. It's such a powerful card. And one of the big advantages of playing white is that you get not only land tax, but you get access to Divine Offering, which is kind of like the disenchant of the format. There are 4 Chain Lightning, which is interesting to me. Some of the lists I saw ran fewer than 4 Chain Lightning. What do you think about using all 4?
I think because you also have the Rook eggs, right? So they have an extra target. You can just shoot your own Rook egg and then bounce it into your opponent.
Yeah,
so they have an additional usage in this deck.
Yeah, very, very good point, actually. He's only running 7 mountains, so the chances of having the 3 red mana available by mid-game are a little bit lower, although he does have 4 Felwar Stones. But you're right, that's a really, really cool interaction, the fact that you can Chain Lightning your own Rook Egg and get a 4/4 flyer to start attacking with, and you also can deal the damage to the creature. I'm sure over the course of the tournament, he did that many, many times. It's just a matter of what are most likely to be the biggest threats that aren't handled by Moat and by Mishra's Factory, the creatures on the ground, and that's little flyers in the sky. And Chain Lightning really serves a good purpose against that. And then he's got an extra layer of defense in the form of Pyrotechnics, which I think is a card I played this card a ton back when Type 2 appeared as a format back in, I think, like mid to late 1995, and was incredibly impressed by it. The card, I think, is really underplayed in a lot of deck lists, and certainly shines in there, although I'm surprised he doesn't have more in his sideboard, which we'll get to later. He has 4 copies of Winds of Change, which feels like a lot. Do you think that?
I like it. I like it.
You like 4?
Yeah, I like it because of the land tax, and because, as you mentioned, we have very little draw engines in this format, right?
Yeah.
So the ability to just draw additional lands with your land tax and then you cast the Winds of Change and get a bunch of other cards. It's like a huge card advantage because the other guy would just slowly empty his hand.
Yeah, that's obviously provided that your opponent is willing to play the tax game with you, right? That's
of course. Yeah.
Yeah, my general feeling about Winds of Change is that's the problem with the card, is that if you're unable to play the tax game, or your opponent doesn't cooperate and you draw like multiple Winds of Change, the card is without the land tax engine going or something like Sylvan Library, it is card disadvantage to an extent. You're paying a card to draw 1 card fewer.
I think he this way of playing with the Ivory Tower might push the other guy to play his lands, because if you get your early Ivory Tower, you're just sitting there accumulating life on 1 land, and the other guy has to deploy his lands.
Right, he has to do something, exactly, and then you're able to get tax running and rolling. Yeah, and because there's no Moxes in the format and there's no disenchant, there's kind of no way around that trap.
Yeah, you have to do it. Yeah, just to get in there.
I noticed he's not using a card that I would have assumed would find its way into this archetype, and that card is Jalem Tome, given how well it synergizes with land tax. And I'm a little surprised to see that. What do you think about the inclusion of Jalem Tome, or why he may not have used it?
I honestly, I have no idea why it isn't here. I mean, it's such a given with land tax that you use that just to get that soft card advantage where you exchange a land from your hand for another card, right?
Yeah, I would have seen, like, if I had built the deck, certainly I think I would have maybe played 1 fewer Winds of Change and probably 1 fewer Land's Edge, and gone with like at least a pair of Jalem Tomes.
Yeah, at least 2.
Fantastic.
Right?
Even if you don't have land tax running, just the card selection and filtering is fantastic. Like, sometimes you don't need Ivory Tower at all. Sometimes you don't need the 3rd one. And often getting some answers or some business cards are good.
Yeah.
He's running 1 copy of City in a Bottle, which is phenomenal in this deck. I'm sure he'd run more of them, actually, if he could get away with it, because it only has interaction with 1 card in the deck, and that's the Rook Egg. Unfortunately, if you play City in a Bottle, it not only kills your Rook Egg, it kills the Rook too.
Is the counter from Arabian Nights?
I believe so. I think that I could be wrong, and maybe the ruling is different.
Let me chime in there.
Of course, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, so Brian, regarding Rook Egg, the committee, we have a rules committee for Four Horsemen, and what we decided was that since the Rook Egg token was not printed in Arabian Nights, I'm not joking. Since there's no Rook Egg token printed in Arabian Nights that has the scimitar symbol, the rules committee said the Rook Egg is not part of the Arabian Nights set.
And there you go.
So therefore, in this case, this strategy of being able to not only chain lightning your own rook and get your rook, but also city in a bottle drop. And if you've got one or more rook eggs out there, you've got those 4/4 flyers at the end of the turn, and it's really powerful.
Yeah, brutal interaction.
Yeah.
Well, obviously, yes, that makes the city in the bottle even better.
Yeah.
It allows him an immediate way to just play the rooks as 4/4 flyers for 4 mana. That's honestly pretty amazing in a format where you don't have Swords to Plowshares, you don't have Psy Blast. It's really hard to kill a 4/4 flyer.
Yeah.
And then he's got Feldon's Cane, which I can definitely understand. One copy of it seems to make sense, right? It's likely you can churn through your deck and pull a lot of lands out of it early.
Mm-hmm.
Having the Cane gives you the ability to indiscriminately throw away lands early, which sometimes you're loath to do, because if you pull all the basic land out of your deck and throw it in the graveyard, you don't have an engine anymore to actually finish the game. And Cane gives you a way to get your lands back to do that. And I doubt you're going to see, the Darks in this format, right?
It is.
Yeah, and I doubt we're going to see Tormod's Crypt floating around too, right? Pretty unlikely that people are worried about recursion strategies. So
that's true.
The Cane's good, and then he's got Golgothian Silex in there, which is a bit odd, given that he's got a pretty high antiquities component in his deck. He's got 4 factories, 4 towers, but maybe he just recognized that there was enough powerful antiquities things. I guess the fact that it does Shatterstorm all of the big powerful artifact creatures that are in the format pretty effectively made it worthwhile. It'd be interesting to know if he would have played more. And then we're going to jump to the mana base real quick. So it looks like 7 mountains and 6 plains, so 13 basic land in total, which seems to be about standard for most of the decks in the format, because I think a lot of people looked at the format and viewed both Strip Mine and Mishra's Factory as obligatory inclusions. You kind of have to play for both of those, and that brings the mana, the land total up to, what is that, 13 plus 8, so it's 21, and 4 Felwar Stones. Going to see those in nearly every deck list because they are the only acceleration that exists in the format. And then finally, a pair of Maze of Ith, which I know Maze of Ith in general, pretty controversial, I think, as another card in the format. There are a lot of people that have very polarized opinions about the card. Anders, what do you think about Maze of Ith as an unrestricted card in Four Horsemen?
Well, when I saw the format, I thought that the 2 main issues here would be enchantments and special lands, right? Because you wouldn't have a lot of answers against them. You've lost Sinkhole, Stone Rain, Ice Storm. You got Blight, Fissure, and what else? Something like that. Strip Mine, obviously. Yeah. So
don't forget
and Blood Moon.
Don't forget Blood Moon.
That will be a key card in this one, I think. We haven't seen it that much in this deck, obviously, but I think it will be a key card.
Yeah, it was a little surprising to me to see that Blood Moon was underplayed. I think there might be 2 reasons behind that. I think one is that red may not be that good of a color yet. That hasn't been determined. And obviously you have to play red, and because you don't have dual lands, you can't just splash some Blood Moons in your sideboard in your blue-white deck.
Yeah.
And on top of that, I think in general, a lot of these players are pretty experienced, particularly the people who are, in the top 8. And one thing you do recognize is that if you're using Blood Moon as a solution to problematic cards like Factory and Workshop, the timing of those things just generally doesn't align in your favor most of the time, in that you often will be beaten to death by Mishra's Factories, assuming you're not going to play them yourself, and you certainly should, even if you are playing Blood Moon.
Yeah, definitely.
But sometimes you either draw the Blood Moon too late. There's no way to ramp out Blood Moon quickly with Black Lotus or Soul Ring or something. So it's going to come online as at the very earliest, probably turn 3. And by then, your opponent with double Workshop draw has already got 2 giant robots in play. And you've got this enchantment, and you go, aha, Blood Moon, I'll take another 12. That's likely to happen. And I think that's probably pushed people away from the card, because there's just no way to deploy it quickly in that backbreaking fashion. And the fact that there's no dual lands means that decks are going to be containing a lot more basic land. And I think a lot of people recognize that Blood Moon isn't really that good of a solution to a small amount of very powerful niche lands, rather than just like, I play it and now your entire deck doesn't work, which is sort of how it works in regular old school. And I think probably if people tested the format, they probably recognized that was the case.
And as you said, I mean, when you don't have that, I mean, there aren't a lot of answers to Maze of Ith then, right? So in this format, it will be even stronger than the regular old school format, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Minus the fact that most of the old school formats have strip mine as a restricted card, and this format does not.
Yeah, that's true.
And I've talked in the past about how I'm a huge advocate for strip mines being legal, not just because it's a solution to all the problematic lands in the format, but I view the card as a very high skill card. And I think that good players understand how to use strip mine to leverage games where they're able to recognize that there's a specific weakness in their opponent and use strip mines strategically and surgically to win games that otherwise would be a lot harder to win. But as we're talking about Blood Moon, it brings us to the sideboard of the deck. Let's go over it pretty quickly. There's 2 copies of Dust to Dust. This is another card that I think is incredibly powerful in the format, given how good artifacts are. And to me is another really strong draw into white. You have 4 Divine Offerings, but there's a lot of decks are running a critical mass of artifact, of big, powerful artifacts, given how strong Mishra's Workshop is, and to a lesser extent, Mana Drain is for getting big artifact things into play. And so I'm a little surprised to see only 2 copies of Dust to Dust in the sideboard, but maybe Steven just recognized that between his 4 Divine Offerings and those 2 cards, he might have artifacts under control. You can see also he has a Detonate. And then there's a copy of Festival. I believe that's that card from the dark right there.
Yeah.
And I probably should have looked up what Festival is. Festival Fog?
No, yeah, it is. I think it stops your opponent from attacking. You have to play it in his upkeep, something like that.
Okay, so it's sort of like Fog, but you have to play it.
Yeah, but not as fast.
Yeah, not as fast, a little bit more predictable, but pretty much the same effect for the most part, which is interesting. He's got 2 copies of Preacher, which is a bit of a surprise. What do you think about the use of Preacher?
I think this deck actually resembles a deck I know, but it's a bit more spicy, where you play with Diamond Valleys and you play with Rook Eggs and Preacher, right? Just to snatch the other creatures and sacrifice them and sacrifice your own Rook Eggs. Yeah. I think in this format, because you don't have a lot of like spot removal on the creatures, some decks will have huge problems removing that Preacher.
So, yeah, absolutely. Like the blue-green deck, right? Or mono blue deck. What do they do against it? They don't have Psionic Blast, which is, and they don't have Chaos Orb, right? Everybody's normally running Chaos Orb, and they have the ability to just deal with a random problem permanent by nature of just getting lucky and drawing Demonic Tutor or Chaos Orb. And in this case, yeah, the person might play Preacher, and you have no way to win the game at that point with your mono blue creature deck or something. What are you going to do? Just suicide your guys into your own guys? It's impossible. It creates an impossible game plan. I would have actually liked to see probably more Preachers in Steven's sideboard as a result of that, because I think it's going to be the ultimate silver bullet against quite a few strategies by nature of how little removal there is.
Maybe take a Festival out for another Preacher. You could.
Yeah, like I mean, I understand the Festival might work in some cases, but certainly in terms of universal power level, it may be not quite on the same level as Preacher. So there's 2 more Mazes of Ith. We've got Greater Realm of Preservation, kind of an interesting choice also, given the fact that there are no X spells in the format at all, and you don't have to worry about those. As far as black creatures are concerned, I didn't really see a lot of black stuff in general, and I guess there are certainly some black creatures. One of the test decks I built was mono black Beatdown, but you're missing a lot of the important key points there. Black doesn't really, I think, hyper competitive until you get to Fallen Empires, because Fallen Empires introduces the order they have in hand, and of course Hymn to Torak, which really elevate black from being a low tier strategy, I think, to being very hyper competitive.
So true.
And without that, I just don't think that black is a big enough menace that you have to worry about getting killed by black creatures. And there's no red X spells. That's an interesting inclusion, but not as interesting as Disharmony. A card we had to look up. It's basically Ray of Command without the ability to attack with a creature. You can snag an attacker during combat. You can only use it as a defender, but you can 2-for-1 your opponent if exactly the right situation arises. You just hope it's not 2 Serendipity Freaks beating you in the face or something. Then you're casting Disharmony to avoid taking 3, or I guess 6.
Pretty great against robots, right? Because they're all 4/4. A lot of them are. So
yeah, that's true. I guess that's true. It does untap the things. You could grab something like a Clockwork Avian and block a Suchi with it, or something similar. Yeah. So maybe he's got it in there for that sort of fringe case. He's got a copy of Aladdin, another potentially devastating permanent against a robots deck. I would have liked to see more copies of Aladdin too. I think that just focusing the sideboard a little more and running more Aladdins and more creatures, you kind of cover 2 of the big bases, right? The point where you might just find that your opponent with no ability to really get a foothold because you've got the ability to just steal their stuff every turn.
Yeah.
There's one copy of a Falling Star there, which is I hear like a rumbling noise. Chad.
Yeah, I think there's some fireworks going on.
Oh, you got fireworks outside?
Yeah, is that Putin coming over?
Yeah, no, I may be one upping you shortly. The Blue Angels, the Fs, I think they're like F-15 dresses.
Oh yeah.
Those acrobatic fighter pilot guys are in Seattle. They're going to be performing right outside my window.
Okay,
so if you start hearing thunder outside, that's what it is. So there's Falling Star, and this is another really interesting card. They actually had to do specific rulings about this. The way that it was handled in other formats online was that it was treated pretty much like Chaos Orb, but enhanced a little bit, that you got to declare up to 2 targets with it. So you'd actually align your 2 cards side by side, and if you successfully flipped it onto both of them, it would deal 3 to both. And but because this is the Wild West, and Chad wanted a pure format, they're playing it like with original rules, which is kind of an interesting way, an interesting thing to coordinate when you're dealing with webcam play. Because how do you know where your opponent's cards are? So apparently you have to, whenever you cast a card, your opponent is not allowed to reorganize or change the arrangement of their cards on the battlefield, and you try to create a relatively equal representation of where their creatures are on your desktop, and then you flip your Falling Star onto them, and whatever gets hit takes 3 damage. So it'll be interesting to see if that ruling continues in the format, or whether or not they'll transition to something that's a little bit more simple and elegant, like the regular old school rule. There's 1 copy of Detonate, and curious to know your thoughts about the single Detonate, or whether or not you would have played with more.
I think you can play with more in this format. I mean, it's devastating against the big robots, right, in the late game. And you have in a deck like this, if you get the land tags rolling with your ivory towers and stuff like that, you'll get your land drops each turn. So I think it's a great card in this format. I understand the Detonate maybe slightly better than the festivals, even though I really like that he has put in those festivals. I mean, it's a new thing, but yeah, I think that Detonates. I think this format will be, at least in the beginning, pretty artifact heavy. So yeah, definitely usable.
Yeah, as long as Workshop's around, right, as an unrestricted card, people are going to be really pushed into robots or some versions of it. And yeah, I think that one of the things about this archetype is that it can have a hard time kind of closing out the game. And Detonate gives you a lot of extra reach in some of those matches where you can just deal an indiscriminate 5 or 6 extra damage, and then you can easily close the game out between a couple of Chain Lightnings and a Land's Edge. Although you'd be unlikely to be using Chain Lightning in matches where you'd be bringing in Detonate, just in terms of what you'd be facing. There's a single copy of Fissure, kind of a catch-all against creatures and lands, and then a single copy of Spirit Link as well. And that's another card that really popped out to me as a decent replacement, kind of in the same vein as Divine Offering, as a decent replacement for Swords to Plowshares. It accomplishes a lot of the same effect against a lot of the creatures in the format. Does kind of the same thing, a little bit weaker in this deck in that you are nearly creatureless, so it's harder to use it as an emergency way to gain life. But overall, it seems to me that card would warrant the inclusion of a few extra copies. I think I would certainly play it over Festival. But anyway, so that's Steven's deck. We're going to move on to the second deck. His opponent here, hopefully I don't slaughter his name here, Arnaud Avenel, a French player who piloted a deck that I think is a little bit more, I wouldn't say obvious, but would come to your mind right away. If I was going to build a deck in this decent format where 4 workshops were legal, I'm going to try to build a workshop-based deck. And the question is, am I going to play monocolor? Am I going to play blue-red? Am I going to play blue-black? And Arnaud ultimately went with a mono-blue version. And I got to say, I love this deck. This deck has so many cool innovations in it. I know we spent a lot of time on Steven's deck, so I'll try to get through this pretty quickly. We don't have to restate a lot of points. So he's got a total of 10 basic islands, 4 Mishra's Workshops, completely insane card, one of the most powerful cards ever printed, and certainly one of the most powerful cards in Four Horsemen. He's got the obligatory 4 Factory, 4 Strip Mine that brings his land count up to 22. He has his single copy of Library of Alexandria, naturally. And now we get to the really interesting stuff. For one, 4 copies of Candelabra of Tawnos. What did you think about when you saw that?
I thought immediately, it's really awesome. I mean, with all the special lands and the ability to just untap and reuse them like this, just the factories, the workshops, the library. Yeah, it really synergizes well with a type of deck like this.
Totally, such a cool card, right? And so woeful, despite the fact that it's incredibly expensive. It's like one of the most expensive cards in Antiquities. I think it's second most expensive, just behind the Workshop. I believe it is, actually, right? It's definitely one of the chase cards from Antiquities, and kind of always has been, actually. When Antiquities first came out, the #1 chase card, can you guess what it was? I don't know if you were, I don't think you were playing when it first came out.
No, that was in '93, right? I started in '94.
Yeah, like, I think March of '94, I believe, is when Antiquities came out. March,
okay, I was a bit later on. I think it came out at the tail end of Legends or something like that. No, I would imagine Candelabra would be up there.
It's a good guess. I think Candelabra was definitely near the top. I think it was maybe the second most valuable card, but the #1 card was actually Argivian Archaeologist.
Oh yeah,
that was the card that everybody really wanted from the set.
I remember that. Yeah,
it just seemed crazy, right? It's so good, and you can use Chaos Orb
yep.
over and over again with it. And then
I had a guy. He made a Lich deck with Mirror Universe for group play, and then he used the Archaeologist just to get the Mirror Universe up again and again.
Just to consecutively kill more people in the group game. Makes perfect sense. But Candelabra, I think, is as powerful as the card is very niche and has shown up in some interesting decks. I know that it's played in Vintage sometimes. It combines incredibly well with Mana Flare effects and cards like High Tide. And so people would use Candelabra and High Tide and Boomerang and type effects to just generate gargantuan amounts of mana. But overall, as valuable as the card is, it's sort of woefully underplayed. And in this deck, it's totally amazing because not only does it give you the ability to double up on Workshop really easily, you get crazy complicated factory shenanigans. And I'm actually looking forward to seeing the interaction of like 2 Candelabras and 3 factories and stuff. How does your opponent even figure that out? Like, how much potential damage is actually coming here, given the fact that all these factories can tap and untap themselves? Even in combat, they can pump themselves, they can pump other factories. It's just madness. So a really neat card to see included, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the games where this card comes into play. He's got 3 copies of the card Reconstruction, which makes a lot of sense in the deck, honestly, particularly given the fact that he's running 4 copies of Sage of Latnam and Transmute Artifact as well. The ability to just regrow one of these powerful artifact effects. And if your opponent manages to remove it, get your city in a bottle back, whatever. Pretty cool. I think that 2 to 3 is probably the right number. And I love seeing that card in the deck. He's got 4 copies of Transmute Artifact. And I have to admit that this card was off my radar, actually, when I was first looking at the format, because I hadn't really thought about the interaction of, progressing and ramping up to the big monsters. You think 4 workshops is enough. That's going to be able to get your big guys online. But a lot of these big artifacts kind of have generate a one-shot effect, particularly the Triskelion and the Tetravis, right? And then you've got this 6-mana thing just sitting in play. Obviously you can move the Tetravites back onto it, or you can have Taunus's Coffin. But most of the time, once Triskelion has done its thing, it's really underwhelming, and it's a 1/1. And Transmute Artifact is like 2 blue mana, gain 6. It's like a dark ritual that makes 4 mana, which is totally insane in a format that's starved for acceleration. And is really neat too, and gives you also a bit of the kind of toolbox quality of the deck. It allows you to fetch up a specific artifact for a specific situation. You can get it gives you effectively 5 copies of the City in a Bottle if you're getting beaten down by a bunch of Arabian Nights creatures. It gives you a Taunus's Coffin if you've got a Triskelion in play. It gives you Jalem Tome if you need card draw. It's just very flexible and powerful and really cool to see. And then we're moving on to Dance of Many. What do you think about that thing?
I really like
last
it.
time we saw a top tier deck with Dance of Many in it.
Yeah, we don't see that every day, but it's like this format's version of Copy Artifact in a deck like this, right? It allows you to for cheap just copy those expensive Triskelions into Travis, get a bunch more counters.
Totally, yeah, fantastic, right? Like most people look at Dance of Many and think, oh, this is just like a really awkward bad clone, but it's not. It's Copy Artifact in this deck for the most part, because obviously you're cloning creatures with it, but most of the things you're going to want to copy are big creatures anyway. And so it gives you that same kind of crazy ramping inevitability that you see with the robots decks in old school, where your opponent just gets like big guy on turn 1, double Copy Artifact on turn 2. And you're like, okay, I'm going to play another Savannah Lion, right? And, and the game's basically over on turn 2. And so having Dance of Many, even though it does have an upkeep, you can often get a lot of effect. You can split off Tetravites and then just let it die. Or you can fire off the Triskelion arms and let it die. And you don't even care about the upkeep at all. Or you've got Sage of Latnam just sitting to the right of Dance of Many, and you can just sack it and draw a card too. So incredible synergy. I love seeing that card in the deck as well. And I love seeing 4 copies of Sage of Latnam. I think that this is another really underplayed card in Old School, actually. In format start for card draw. The problem is that it's overshadowed by the raw power of the restricted list. Incrementally sacking artifacts for 5 turns to draw 1 card at a turn at a time is overshadowed by somebody who just casts Time Twister or Brain Geyser or something. But in formats that are starved for card draw, where you have a limited card pool, cards like Sage of Latnam are really able to shine, and it's awesome seeing 4 of those in the deck too. It has so many cool interactions with the deck, and it's probably one of I would say that it's one of his best cards, and hard to remove too. And a lot of people would probably just let it hang out too because they're more worried about artifacts or bigger artifacts.
You actually see it in the regular Old School scene in Europe as well, in the robot mirror matchup and in the robot versus a deck matchup, where you sideboard your Abyss out and then take the Sages in, because it's so much about the card advantage, and there's so much artifact destruction coming in after the sideboard, right?
Totally, yeah. I mean, what a nightmare for control deck, right? You board into four Swords Plowshares, 4 Disenchant, 4 Divine Offering, and the guy's got 2 Sages of Latnam sitting in play untapped, and you're like,
exactly. And each time he removes stuff, you get card advantage out of it. And if he destroys a Triskelion, then you'll shoot him with the Trisk and then sack it to the Sage.
Yeah, so, and then it just keeps going, and there's no way to stop you. Super nightmare situation, particularly because against robots, most of the time, people are running Abyss, and control decks are going to take Abyss out. It's totally a dead card, and that makes the Sages just way stronger.
Yeah. So you're taking 2, 3, 4 against the deck.
Yeah, it's not like you can hold back on Plowshares by not killing a Suchi that's beating you in the face for 4, because the guy might have a Sage of Latnam in play, and you might even kill a Suchi over a Sage of Latnam anyway with swords, because you can't afford the damage. So he's got 4 copies of Felwar Stone. That's an obvious inclusion, given it's pretty much the only fast mana in the format that makes sense to play. There are mana batteries as well from Legends, and I'm kind of a little surprised and a little sad that nobody played Mana Battery, but I can understand that paying 4 mana for a 1 mana artifact, not so great, even if it can power up over multiple turns. He does have the Jail and Tome that we talked about in the last matchup. Really, really glad to see that. I think that I would definitely run 2 to 3 copies of the card. It is just phenomenally powerful. And he's got 2 copies of Taunus's Coffin, incredibly powerful card that has great synergies with all sorts of different things. You can use Taunus's Coffin to either coffin away things like Triskelion and Tetravis to get more counters. You can also do it on Dance of Many too, to reset those as well. And you can even avoid paying upkeep too by doing that. You stack the upkeep effect, Taunus's Coffin, the thing, it goes away, and then next turn you untap the Coffin, it comes into play tapped, but you dodge both the trigger at the start of combat, you don't have to pay the upkeep on the next turn, and you get your counters reset too. So fantastic synergy with both those cards. 4 Suchi, biggest, baddest artifact brawler in the format. You see this guy all over the place in Old School. Totally amazing, even though the format does incidentally have mana burn. But in addition to the 4 factories that Arnaud is running, he also has 4 Candelabras of Taunus. So he's got extra ways to funnel the mana burn from Suchi, if in fact it dies in combat, into something else that's productive. He has 2 copies of Clockwork Avian, which is amazing to see as well. What do you think about seeing Clockwork Avian in a competitive deck?
Really like it in this one, also because, as you mentioned earlier, the modes will be so prevalent, right? And it's a great counter against that, and also obviously works well with the workshop. So yeah, I like it.
I love seeing Clockwork Avian. Just another kind of sleeper card that is overshadowed by the other really powerful artifacts. You almost never see Clockwork Avian in a robots deck. It's just really hard to fit it amongst the restricted list and all the other stuff that you put into that deck. And it's awesome that it has a chance to shine. He's got 2 copies of Triskelion, the cool little aircraft carrier creature that synergizes incredibly well with both Dance of Many and with Sage of Latnam, and even with Taunus's Coffin, although it's quite slow. And then, of course, he has 4 copies of the best artifact creature by far, the Triskelion, at least in a deck like this, which is just all-purpose, incredible, direct damage, removal, everything you'd ever want in one sleek 3-arm package. So let's move on to the sideboard. There's another copy of Reconstruction there. There's another 2 copies of Dance of Many, and then, very interestingly, there's 4 copies of Hurkyl's Recall. What do you think about the inclusion of 4 copies of that card?
I don't think I really get it. I think it's a bit excessive, maybe. I like the card, and I guess it's against the mirror, and because he anticipated that there'll be so many robot decks here.
Yeah.
But 4...
I think my biggest question when I see Hurkyl's Recall is when you're constructing this deck, you really do have to think about, because it's such an obvious strategy, right? Everybody says, okay, well, workshops are going to be everywhere and big artifact creatures are going to be everywhere. What's the best card in the format that deals with that? And that card, of course, is from Antiquities. It's the 3 blue mana enchantment, Energy Flux. Energy Flux is got to be everywhere, and the card is game over for this deck. If Energy Flux resolves, you're just dead. I don't even know what you would do. You know, the idea, certainly you can pay like 2 mana to keep one of your things in play, but Workshop doesn't provide mana to upkeep Energy Flux.
You need to kill it in 2 turns.
Yeah, Felwarstone dies, Candelabra dies, your creatures cost 1 million mana, Jalem Tome is horrible. Like every card in the deck just is dead when that card is in play. And for me, at least in terms of constructing the sideboard, that would be my #1 concern. I would play with every card I possibly could that would allow me to stop Flux. I would play both Boomerang and, of course, Mana Drain. Mana Drain costs 2, Flux costs 3. That gives you a way to stop it.
You know, Brian, what I thought here was a couple of things. One, he doesn't have Mana Drain in the main deck, which really shocked me, right? Because as Michael said, you know, as long as 4 Mana Drains are allowed, I'm going to have a 4 Horsemen deck that's always going to have 4 Mana Drains. Definitely. So it was really curious to me that Arnaud decided, and he's a very seasoned player. You know, he's a gentleman who clearly was playing in '93, and you know, he played it very, very eloquently in the match we're going to be seeing here in a moment. But I was so surprised no Mana Drains. But I think he opted for the drawing engine of the Sage and the reconstructions. The Hurkyl's Recall, you know, I mean, Hurkyl's Recall is very good with Tetravis. Or Triskelion, excuse me. If you don't have your other artifacts in play, and like let's say your Triskelion gets Divine Offering, if you don't want to kill itself with the little, you know, 2 points to you, 1 point to Triskelion, you could Hurkyl's Recall it, bring your stuff back, and you avoid the Divine Offering, you know, a scenario. You get your counters back when you play the Triskelion again. So that's what I thought. If he comes up against, you know, another robots deck, it's a way to get your attack in by getting rid of all their blockers at once, and it has the added benefit of being able to bounce your things that get your counters back. That's what I thought.
Yeah, I mean, I think that your reasoning is certainly sound, and I think that certainly he's probably played the card for the mirror, which he expects everywhere.
Yes, for the players, you know,
and it has a secondary. It's defensive as well, right? If your opponent Shatterstorms you or something, you can pull all your stuff back into your hand. If they sacrifice a Golgothian Silex to kill all the Antiquities creatures, you can pull it back into your hand. That's such a fringe case, though, versus like my opponent just goes first and goes, here's turn 3 Energy Flux, go ahead.
Yeah, right? that is true. And he does not have the Mana Drain or any ability to counter, but also you know, he's running 10 islands, so it's not like he couldn't hope for 2 blue.
Felwarstone, which make blue against Energy Flux.
So if he has Felwarstone and they have blue, or City of Brass, whatever. But Arnold is playing in tournament too, so maybe we should do an interview with him in the second.
I'd be very curious to hear the mindset. It just, because Mana Drain just seems so obviously powerful and incredibly strong in this deck. That is something we should have probably mentioned when we were going over the main deck.
It would help.
Why is Mana Drain not here?
It would help address the weakness that you have pointed out, that, you know, if someone drops Energy Flux, you're screwed. And
yeah, maybe he just, I mean, it's possible that he just sort of, maybe he thought it was unsportsmanlike. It's like,
could be.
It's not fair that you get to play with 4 of them when it's a restricted card in all the other old school formats. I'm not going to take the obvious route and run 4 Mana Drains.
Yeah, and we don't want to give anything away, but let's just say that, you know, perhaps the missing Mana Drains weren't a disadvantage as significant as one might think.
Yeah, my general suspicion is that Arnaud got a little lucky and dodged Energy Flux throughout the Swiss rounds, and probably in the top 8 as well. So we got 4 Azure Drakes, which is a pretty neat inclusion as well. What do you think about those, Anders?
We lost a deck. Oh, there it is. I think, I like them as well. Also, yet another flying creature, right? Just to get in against mode, and it's unboltable. I mean, you can't Chain Lightning it, and you can't Falling Star it. And 4 mana, it's a decent creature, I think.
Just a little hard to cast, I think. You know, that's just the main reason. There isn't really, it doesn't have any synergy with the Workshop component of the deck. and
No.
and the thing too is it's overshadowed by a lot of the best creatures in the format, and you kind of already have this resiliency against.
Yeah, it's true,
against
because
fast
you
creatures
already
anyway.
have the flyers. Yeah,
But
maybe
you've got
it's
these big beefy guys already that come down on turn 2.
perhaps the anticipation is that after sideboard, the other guy will take a lot of stuff in against his artifact creatures, and then he can like make a switcheroo and get some non-artifact creatures in there.
That's true, and given and in that situation, maybe something, if you really want to play a robust non-artifact flyer, then the Serendib Efreet seems more obvious to me, other than the fact that you take damage from it. So I'm sure he had his reasons for it. It'd be interesting to talk with him about that as well.
I think you had a point before with the Spirit Link that it would be like this great removal card in this format, and we also talked about the Mace of Ith, right? So maybe Serendib Efreet aren't exactly the powerhouse that we see in old school.
Yeah, well, that's really true. Just to talk briefly about another format, the 7-point old school singleton format, which is really the non-main old school format that I'm the most familiar with. And in that format, both Serendib Efreet and Juzam Jin, which are both obviously powerhouses anyway, it's a singleton format, they're definitely a lot weaker because a lot of decks are running Maze, Spirit Link, also Icy Manipulator is in every single deck list in that format. It's basically like it's as much of an auto include as Chaos Orb is, and all 3 of those cards really make both Serendib and Juzam terrible.
Yeah, a lot weaker, likely.
And you only have one copy of one. You only have one Juzam and one Serendib anyway. And like playing the Serendib on turn 3, and your opponent goes, "I'll Spirit Link it," and now it totally changes the way the game unfolds. They're gaining a life a turn. You're losing a life a turn. It's just
and you can't remove it in this format. I mean, if you Spirit Link is Serendib Efreet, you're screwed.
Yeah, you're just screwed. So we got Golgothian Silex, another kind of interesting inclusion given his incredibly high critical mass of Antiquities cards.
maybe he makes a switcheroo to the Drakes and then puts in that Golgothian Silex.
Yeah, I mean, there's something going on here that we're probably not privy to, and maybe we'll figure that out as the games progress. I'd be curious to know what matchup the Golgothian Silex comes in for, because it's like how many of his own things are destroyed by that. And then we got 3 Relic Bearers, another really cool card that is woefully underplayed and is surprisingly strong in a lot of formats where it shows up, and it's really neat to see that in here as well. That card seems to me like it would be insane in the mirror, way better, honestly, than Hurkyl's Recall and Golgothian Silex.
Yeah.
And I would much rather see something like 4 copies of Relic Barrier and fewer Hurkyl's Recalls in the mirror. Like, how do you win against Relic Barrier, right?
Yeah, totally
it's just
agree.
ridiculous.
It's like Icy laid on steroids, right?
Absolutely. You have no way to remove it, and it totally wrecks factories and stuff too. It's just so strong in a matchup where you can't get rid of your opponent's Relic Bearer. They have like this Icy that costs 0 mana to use and 2 mana to cast. Are you kidding me? Just crazy. But anyway, we've talked about these decks for ages, and I think it is time for the matches. So if Chad will help us out here, we can move to the first game of the semifinals.
Okay, guys. I would recommend we pause here and let me start a new video, because this video will be massive. So
I totally recommend. I think that's perfect.
Right.
We have an introductory video, and then we have the games.
All right, so I'm going to pause the video, and then we will pick up right